man. Yeah, so this week I think has been both busy and not busy, in a sense in Ukraine.
Hmm.
It's been very interesting in how we've seen sort of uh, somewhat of a stalemate, or not a stalemate per se, because the Russians obviously still somewhat have an advantage at this point. But we've seen sort of a slowing down of the action as Russian forces do something, either are working on resupplying or working on sort of repositioning and working to sort of solidify their existing positions in the region. We've seen that sort of around Kiev over the past week, where Russian forces have
Hmm.
sort of they're trying to encircle the city, but as a U.S. official said today, and I'm gonna requote I believe Dan LeBoth on this, but there was where is it here? Um, oh Lord.
What was it you were looking for?
Yeah, just a certain quote, basically just specifying from the Pentagon uh, that. All right, I cannot find this. All right, well, okay. So I'll just say this on and quote myself on this, but I really do not think at this point the Russians have a clear path to encircling Kiev because they haven't done it yet. Um, so they either have to fix their supply situation or gather more troops or do something to change that.
Yeah, I mean, looking at like kind of there's a lot of people making maps at the moment. They all roughly say the same thing. Russia trying to push on Kiev from like the north, west, and also now they're coming at them from the east. They seem to have kind of not given up on taking Kharkiv and that kind of region, but kind of started maybe pushing a lot more westwards and kind of bypassing a lot of major cities and just trying to make another rush on Kiev, um, which seems to have been halted, like you were saying. Like they haven't made a huge amount of ground um, in recent days. They seem to be kind of stalled. Is it? I'm going to pronounce it horribly. Is it Irpin or Irpin? With New York Times journalist whose name I'm unfortunately drawn a blank on, was killed either yesterday or the day before. But I believe that's where he was killed, shot at a checkpoint. It seems like, yeah, they were trying to push in that direction. We've seen from both satellite imagery and imagery from the ground that Ukrainian forces have destroyed bridges leading over the river there, so that's obviously slowed them down on that front. And also, we saw the US saying that huge 40-mile long convoy seems to have largely broken up now.
Yeah, well, I think as they said, broken up was the wrong word. It's more redistributed,
Yeah,
sort
yeah.
of, or it's gotten to operational positions. I think the main thing we've seen at this point is that the Ukrainians have had the time sort of to coalesce around Irpin, around that the area around Bucha, and sort of the bordering areas around Hostomel, which at this point I believe has been taken by Russian forces, but serves sort of as a reliable area where the front line is. Um, and they have sort of devoted a lot of their defensive capabilities near Kiev to that area. We also saw one of the big advantages they had was they flooded out a fairly sizable area of the Irpin River north of Kiev, which is sort of, I think I had posted a picture of it
Hmm.
a few days ago, but it's basically turned that entire area north of the city into a massive marsh that you can't really drive tanks over. You can't, put bridging units over it because it's just a marsh at this point. So that's serving as a fairly good anchor for them in the north. And then, of course, we're seeing the defensive line sort of anchored on that river all the way down to the meeting point of the Bucha River as well. And we have seen Russian forces sort of cross the Bucha River in a couple of points. Most definitely at this point, we know they've crossed west of Irpin. So
Hmm.
they have a fairly solid hold, at least in that area. So that serves as sort of a potential area where they may try to exploit the crossing they've already made. But we really haven't seen them sort of progress to take areas more towards the west and the southwest. So the Ukrainians have a fairly reliable supply line at this point, heading into Kiev from the south and from the southwest. And we've seen them taking advantage of that for the past few weeks or past couple of weeks now, just to funnel both troops and weapons into the city, which has made a lot of Russian progress extremely difficult. And the main operational area we're seeing the Russians sort of, at least be successful, or they were successful and are now sort of solidifying their gains, is additionally in the south. The current siege around Mariupol is, of course, still ongoing and is fairly brutal from what we've seen. There's a lot of fighting in the city, which, of course, carries a lot of damage to civilian areas and causes a number of civilian casualties.
No, I mean, we've seen a couple of videos from Mariupol today, haven't we? There was the drone footage, which just showed like the sheer destruction of the city, which is horrendous. It really did remind me of seeing some like very similar videos from Syria after destruction there. It was just a lot of the city was just rubble. Apartment buildings had collapsed. It was just streets were covered in rubble. It's really, really heavy fighting there. And we got a sense of that as well. I think as of for all their issues, have been releasing a lot of footage from the fighting there. And again, the footage they released today of the vehicle combat they were in. I believe they were in a BTR-4, Ukrainian BTR-4, and they were engaging a Russian T-72, and it looked like also a BMP as well. Very, very close range, the BMP. I mean, it's difficult to tell from the camera, I suppose. I don't know what the magnification was, but seemed very, very close range fighting in the streets there. So yeah, the fighting in Mariupol looks absolutely brutal at the moment, and of course, the people who are suffering the most are still the civilians that are trapped there.
Yeah, and the repeated collapse of any chance to put together a civilian evacuation corridor has been particularly damaging to the civilian population there, as we've seen both in Kiev, in Irpin, in Mariupol, or even out of Kharkiv as well. Any chances for civilian evacuations have usually fallen apart within a few hours. Between just fighting restarting or the evacuation areas getting shelled. I do think the New York Times front page image showing the evacuees who had been killed trying to evacuate from Irpin was particularly telling to how dangerous and just horrifying it is for the civilian population in that area. I think that's the best word at this point.
No, definitely. And again, it's not even like it's isolated incidents of these civilian corridors being shelled. Bringing it back to Syria, it happened countless times in Syria where the Assad regime, with obviously Russia's support, they would offer these kind of humanitarian corridors and give them a deadline of a few days for everyone to leave, and then shell these corridors, just preventing anyone from actually leaving. And then when the deadline expired, blanket statement that anyone still in the city was obviously still a terrorist and still a fighter, because the opportunity for civilians to leave had passed. And we saw that happen a lot in Syria. We saw it in Ukraine in 2014. I believe there's, I can't remember the name of the city now off the top of my head. It wasn't Debaltseve, it was the other one. Which
was it near Donetsk or near to Luhansk?
I can't remember exactly where it was. And that's really going to annoy me. But yeah, there was a city held by Ukraine that was surrounded. The soldiers were offered a corridor out, if they, laid down their arms, etc., etc. And then whilst retreating, were were shelled, and hundreds killed in that instance. So it wasn't so much civilians, but that was a corridor offered to the soldiers to leave through, and then very quickly Russians, separatists, they broke the word almost immediately. So it's almost a tactic at this point for Russia and Russian proxies to kind of offer these corridors and then immediately attack the corridors if anyone takes them up on it. To prevent to prevent people leaving, which is, I mean, there's no word for it. It's just evil, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess there's a certain point, and it may also have to do with the lack of lower level control we've seen among Russian units as well. The Russians may not actually be able to sort of enforce a ceasefire on their own side, and that's something that we've seen historically as an issue with Russian forces, is that sort of a lighter, lower level officer corps. I believe um, I don't remember who said this, but it was a very good observation that the Russians are the orders are going from the high level to mid level commanders, but they aren't really getting down to that lower level as we're seeing. And the second they meet contact, things sort of fall apart into more of a chaotic scene. We've seen that.
Oh, hello. You cut off there. You still there?
Oh, sorry. Did everyone lose me for a sec? Sorry about that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, for me, you went quiet for a little
Okay,
sec.
I'll just restart there. But we've sort of seen, when Russian forces meet initial contact, there may be a bit of chaos as they, uh, disperse or regroup or, move into fighting positions and attempt to break contact quickly, which has sort of impeded their ability to, follow standard Russian doctrine of trying to exploit an opening or a hole in the front line. Um, we've seen that less with some of the more experienced units. I know I can pretty much automatically say that First and Fourth Guards Tank Army have been extremely competent in what they're doing. I mean, they pushed across most of the north of the country and are now on the eastern suburbs of Kiev. I think that was actually more fourth, or I think it was a combination of first and fourth, and I believe maybe 47th Tank Army as well. That's just based on the ISW map, but those are more experienced units, and we've seen them sort of move better across open terrain. They've exploited openings far more effectively than other units have. And we'll sort of see how they do once they actually reach, a more urban area. And I think that is the other main thing I sort of wanted to talk about, was the fact that we've actually seen sort of the Russians really not want to occupy urban areas, at least in the north. I mean, you've seen bypassing Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv, even, the situation in Kiev. Whenever Russian forces have sort of gotten into more urban areas, things have fallen apart. And I think that comes down to a couple of issues, at least at this point. The Russian forces are very mechanized, and that is the nature of how they've had to move into the country. Of course, you're gonna have mechanized infantry forces, you're gonna have armored forces pushing in first. And the problem is they'll get into more urban areas and they'll either be stuck in their vehicles, or it'll be armored forces without much infantry support, which, again, in an urban area is not great. I don't think there's a better term for that.
No, I was going to say, well, what you're saying is, they're definitely not. They're trying to avoid large population centers where they can. And you just have to look at Melitopol to see exactly why. There's huge protests on a daily basis against Ukrainian occupation there. And luckily, thank God, at the moment it's been relatively peaceful. I believe the mayor of the city was arrested by the Russians, and that's what a large amount of the protests recently have been focused around. The release of the mayor. But yeah, there was absolutely huge protests. Anti-Russian occupation protests in Melitopol. And it's compared to some of the cities they're trying to capture, like Kharkiv, Mariupol, Kiev. It's still relatively minor. And And I think it's very lucky for Russia at the moment that things are peaceful, because if these protests suddenly turn into more of an insurgency, they're going to have real issues kind of holding on to these cities in the south. If they suddenly have to divert a lot of forces away from the actual offensive to putting down insurgencies on in their rear as well. So I think that's something which, whilst hasn't happened at the moment, could definitely go that way. The way things are
Absolutely.
going.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we've also seen in the South is the South, obviously, or at least in the southeast part of the country, it's more Russian speaking. There's a larger population that may be friendlier to Russian troops. And they had less time to sort of prepare and to sort of see the situation evolve in the country, and we've still seen the number of protests we have. So those are the areas that would probably have the lowest quantity of protests in the entire situation. And we're still seeing the Russians have to devote a number of troops to sort of containing the protests in these cities, to sort of serve as occupation forces. Whereas in the north, I can't even imagine how ugly it would get in somewhere, Kiev or in Chernihiv, where the civilian population won't just be protesting; they'll be, actually trying to fight back. And that's something that's just very, very, very hard to deal with. The U.S. didn't have to deal with that really in Afghanistan as much. It was more fighting against armed groups more than just the civilians in any city. And you can even look at what happened to the U.S. just fighting small, mostly disparate armed forces. It was ugly, and the number of troops that had to be devoted to sort of contain that was massive. And I don't really think there's a chance that there is going to be a willing or a very stable occupational government if the Russians manage to take over Ukraine, which at this point is still in question. If they even manage to take Kiev, that's an open question. I think that still exists. But any sort of occupational government wouldn't be stable in any way, shape, or form. They would be immediately beset from multiple sides by members of the population. We already saw that with Maidan in 2014 and late 2013. It's just any government that was any puppet government by Russia, just it wouldn't be stable.
No, and again, I think that all comes back down to, again, I don't know if Russia would just believe in their own propaganda a little bit too much about Ukraine being under the control of Nazis, and these Ukrainian people who would be throwing roses on the road when the Russian tanks are rolling past, in a way they were fully expecting your complete capitulation within days. Really, if you look at what what the there was like Russian state media had articles ready to post on the first weekend, didn't they? Maybe 3-4 days into the invasion, they had like victory articles ready to go.
Oh, and there are certainly great quotes by some choice Twitter accounts who will remain unmentioned at this point. But it was very clear that the general, at least public, maybe even private or high level governmental opinion was the Ukrainians will fall in 3 days. We'll land paratroopers in Hostomel, and they'll roll into the city and take Zelensky, and we'll be able to put in a puppet government. It'll be 2014 all over again.
Yeah, and again, that's the one thing I kind of didn't expect. I never would have guessed how much of resistance Ukraine would have put up. We're more than likely going to make it to 3 weeks this week, or since the invasion, and Russia's still not, still haven't really made any major gains. But I never would have said we would be at this stage 3 weeks ago. We're not a lot has changed in terms of Russia's invasion over the last 2 and a bit weeks. They've made a lot of really quick gains very, very quickly in the first 2 or 3 days. I think, as everyone expected. I mean, I think even in the first day they were in Kiev, right? Especially with the helicopter landing in Hostomel. So since that first day and landing, in Hostomel, they've not pushed that much further towards Kiev. I mean, they've got closer, But considering, they were there in, a matter of hours on day one, and now we're, 2 weeks in, and they've only gone another maybe 5-10 kilometers. It really is surprising. And yeah, I again, I'm kind of rambling, but kind of going back to my point is, I was fully expecting the Ukrainians to fight. I wasn't expecting them to kind of just lay down their arms and welcome the Russians, as a lot of people were suggesting. But I don't think anyone was expecting exactly how well they've been fighting. I was expecting kind of like brave resistance for like a week or a few days, and then to kind of just collapse, as I think most people would. But I think they've surprised not just Russia, but I think they've surprised a lot of Western nations as well with just how well they're doing.
Yeah, and the lack, honestly, one of the biggest failures I think the Russians, or at least in the Russian invasion, has been the failure to control the information. In Ukraine. I mean, the Ukrainian president has been, or is the entire Ukrainian government has been able to communicate to their citizens pretty much in every place in Ukraine reliably. We've had information coming out of Ukraine regularly, and in a very concise manner. Pretty much all of the media outlets in Ukraine, both on the governmental side and on the private side, have been able to broadcast a fairly, a narrative that is very pro-government, and it looks really good for the government. Um, and we're the Russians have not been able to sort of shut that down. Videos are still coming from the front lines, or just behind the front. People, even in Sumy or Chernihiv, where they've been under attack by the Russians for almost 3 weeks now, still have fairly reliable internet connection. It's intermittent, but they still get it, and videos can still come out of there. And so we're continuing to see this, and it's basically just spent the last 2 or 3 weeks at this point reinforcing the Ukrainian narrative that they're a defending force, they can win this, the Russians are taking massive casualties. And it's just increased the amount of patriotism and potential resistance we'll see by a massive amount.
Yeah, and going on to the whole kind of patriotism and being under invaded by a foreign power, that kind of like leads me on to my point of the reports in the last couple of days that Russia is looking towards Syria to recruit from the Syrian army there, to kind of maybe shore up their own forces in Ukraine a little bit, which normally I wouldn't. Normally these stories, every time there's a war, you get these kind of reports that there's recruitment going on in Syria for one side or the other. I haven't spoken to several reliable people in regards to Syria. It seems it's definitely happening. There's recruitment going on. I mean, Russia themselves have said they had, what was it, 16,000 willing soldiers in Syria, or in the Middle East, I believe was the exact wording, willing to go to Ukraine. And if you think that people are angry now that they're being occupied by Russian troops, I mean, think about how angry these people are going to be if suddenly these Russian troops are replaced with Syrian troops, which we've seen over the last decade, aren't. Trying to think of a way to put it. They aren't as disciplined, shall we say? Again, I bring it up a lot, but
I mean, they're viewed as even more foreign than the Russians. I mean, the Russians.
Oh yeah, yeah.
This appeal of a bunch of people in your country speak Russian, and Ukrainian is pretty close to Russian, and all the Soviet Union propaganda as well. But you sort of lose that with bringing in troops from Syria, or from I mean, we've heard rumors of Libya, but that's still unconfirmed at this point. But that aspect as well is incredibly damaging to any narrative the Russians want to put together. And on top of that, I mean, the presence of Chechens as well has given the Ukrainians a bit of a propaganda win.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I was going to say, whilst in the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan in the last year or so, Turkey recruited, I can't remember the exact number, but it was hundreds of Syrian fighters to come fight on the side of Azerbaijan. And whilst ultimately Azerbaijan won the war, I think it done a lot of damage to them. I mean, not that they cared, but a lot of damage to them in the public eye by recruiting these Syrians who, in Syria committed some, the groups they were coming from were notorious for committing war crimes and, just general horrible stuff, to like the population in Syria. And then obviously they came to fight in these other conflicts, and there was some, in the war there was some horrific war crimes themselves, the beheading of corpses and mutilation of corpses and the destruction of like religious symbols and stuff like that. And the Syrian government, their military there it's one of the most brutal. They've been fighting a civil war for the last decade.
Yeah, and
you know,
it's something that's actually fairly interesting, at least that I've seen, is that Russia, who's very careful about controlling the narrative around a lot of issues, they're very aggressive with state media and with a combination of bot campaigns, disinformation campaigns, and a number of other, frankly, very well put together media plans and general propaganda plans. To see them sort of put together something that is pretty careless, at least when it comes to a PR perspective, how much will Syrian fighters help them, sort of from just a propaganda perspective within Ukraine, versus how much it's going to actually benefit them, from a practical warfighting capability perspective. I really don't see how many Syrians they'd be able to move into the area, and it would end up just causing them a number of issues. We've basically just seen this sort of loss of control, at least from the media perspective and from a narrative perspective, that I didn't really expect to see, especially coming from Russia.
No, and again, it just seems like desperation, doesn't it, from Russia's perspective? I mean, again, we still have no real idea what the official death toll is from Russia at the moment. Obviously, the Ukrainian government say one thing, which is wildly inflated. I believe they're claiming 12 or 13,000. I know the US, I think they're saying it's close to the same number, but again, I'm not sure I'm going to fully believe US estimates at the moment because they have the same benefit as Ukraine do in kind of hyping up or overinflating, Russian losses. But it's definitely many, many times more than Russia were expecting or even planning for. And I'm wondering if that's now starting to have an effect domestically. We saw quite early on there was a clip of a low level Russian politician talking about the conscripts that were sent to Ukraine, and out of a group of 200, I believe only like 10 or 15 returned. The others have been killed. So like Russian losses are absolutely catastrophic in at least on some of the fronts in Ukraine. And like what I'm thinking is obviously these bodies are piling up, these coffins are going home. From what I've heard from a lot of people living in Russia is Russian military mothers, so they have a lot of power, like political power, and there's been a lot of maybe some dissent starting to appear there. So I'm wondering if Russia is going to start maybe trying to replace some Russian troops with Syrian troops, probably not on the front line again, probably to station in the cities already under Russian control to kind of put down any kind of protests or uprisings, and free up more Russian troops on the front line. But again, like I said, that comes with its own set of issues. Both, actually, Syrian troops aren't known for being, elite or even competent. If we're being blunt about it,
I mean, they are experienced, of course,
experienced,
and
yeah, but
they are also very experienced in counterinsurgency operations as well, which I think the Russians may be one of the attractive options for the Russians. But at the same time, again, they're not going to be winning any hearts and minds of the Ukrainian people. They're going to be, they're going to be doing fairly violent things, and they're going to be seen as even more of an outside, uh, even more of an outside influence, or even more of an outside player. So I'm not entirely sure how that'll go over for the Russians, but I don't assume it'll be very good for them, at least in that aspect.
No, and going back.
Sorry, it obviously makes the fact that
your mic's messed up, man. Your mic's a lot of static, a lot of interference on your mic there. Do you want to try unplugging it, plugging it back in, or don't know what it was you were using?
Technical difficulties, yeah. I guess we'll just vamp until he can get back. But I mean, I think we've seen a lot of these issues, and we will into the future. I think the longer that the Russians fail to make major gains, and the longer that they fail to take Kiev, the more the Ukrainian government will be able to put together a better defense of Kiev. The more they'll be able to get more weapons and supplies. We've seen Rzeszów in Poland become just this massive hub of defensive munitions coming from a number of NATO countries and further abroad. But we're seeing that sort of being funneled into Ukraine right now. Russia did say they would hit, supply lines in, Western Ukraine or wherever. But one of the main issues with that is, and I think I talked about this yesterday, but Russia doesn't have the best ability to project their power into that part of Ukraine. In order to sort of hit those assets, they would need not just good, ISR capabilities in the area. They would probably need assets on the ground. They would need, aircraft with precision guided munitions. Honestly, it would be legitimately something hard for even the U.S. to do to interdict arms shipments like that, because the Ukrainians have gotten, pretty good at concealing them, at transporting them in, an efficient way into Kiev, and it's something that the Russians have had trouble already interdicting, and I don't think it'll change anytime in the near future.
Yeah, and I don't think Russia would ever really attempt it. I mean, I don't. Obviously, it wouldn't start a war between NATO and Russia. I don't think it would be. It wouldn't be an Article 5 situation if they did strike these shipments inside Ukraine. But I just don't think it's not worth the risk, because it sets a dangerous kind of precedent if you suddenly start, if Russia starts striking US arms shipments to Ukraine, that it opens up US to do the same thing to Russia elsewhere, which at the moment,
I think the implication was that they would hit said shipments after they had been transferred over to
okay.
I think the way it's currently set up, and this is me completely unprofessional guessing, so this is in no way like something that I actually have backed up with proof, but the transfers are probably happening possibly inside Poland, maybe at the border, but I do not think any NATO assets are traveling into Ukraine to take assets over the border. So I think the main thing that Russia was sort of threatening was hitting the munitions provided by Western countries inside of Ukraine. And again, at this point, I don't think they really have the ability to do it. The strike on the former training base in Western Ukraine was more of a message than anything. And depending on the reports, a number of the cruise missiles were shot down in the process, which is probably an indication that the Ukrainian air defense network is even more robust in that area than I think we thought it was previously.
Yeah, no, definitely. And that might be what the threat was. They might have been threatening to bomb the shipments, when they're already in Ukraine and handed over. But that's, it's not much of a threat at that point. I just feel like that would be sensible. No, striking weapons depots. Like it doesn't seem like it's really newsworthy. That's why the reason I thought it was the other way around, and maybe they're trying to actually strike, maybe when they were in transit. That's what I thought. The claim was, and obviously that would be a much bigger threat.
Yeah, I mean the Russians have obviously made a number of threats, probably more in private as well, and more at the diplomatic level, which probably also somewhat contributed to the lack of any new MiG-29s headed to Ukraine.
Yeah, that was a really, really weird, annoying kind of few days, wasn't it? That the whole MiG-29 story.
That, I mean, my opinion of that still sort of stands, is that it wouldn't be exactly the most useful transfer, just because from what we've seen, the number of Ukrainian Air Force assets that have been actually destroyed still pretty low. And we still sort of, I mean, the Russians have a fairly robust air defense network. The main risk to Russian aircraft is ground-based air defense, like manpads and other sort of short-range air defense near the Ukrainian front. That we've seen has claimed a number of Russian aircraft. We just saw today some Russian pilot managed to limp an Su-25 back to base with, frankly, extreme damage. Don't really know how he got it back, but it got back. But it's a large danger for any Russian aircraft conducting sorties, and probably more so than the Ukrainians actually trying to interdict them with air assets.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, whilst the MiG-29 transfer would look great, yeah, I don't know how much use they'd get out of them again, because it seems, like you said, that most of the Ukrainian current air force is still operational. Maybe if they had pilots to come along with those MiG-29s and all the rest of it, then that would be very useful. But just the aircraft on their own, I guess, probably wouldn't be massively beneficial. I think largely due to the part of the Ukrainian Air Force success is they're just moving around constantly. They're moving their jets, they're moving their helicopters, they're not leaving them in one place for too long. And obviously Ukraine being a huge country, Russia having real issues, not only tracking down these aircraft, these assets, but when they do find them, they're so spread out over so many air bases that they're only, there's only a handful of assets at any one place at any one time by the looks of it. So I think that's another, huge reason why, Russia's really struggling to get a handle on the Air Force. And also the whole TB2 issue, which, again, I can't believe how effective that's been. It seems, every day or every other day we get another couple of videos of strikes on real high value targets, air defense or things of that nature.
I think the current theory around why the TB2s have been so effective is that it's actually pretty hard for most modern radars that aren't very high frequency to identify a TB2 from other sorts of noise sources in the environment. And what previously, if there was any sort of mechanism to sort of block out noise from a radar's integrated system, it might actually end up blocking a possible TB2 return, because they're pretty small, they're composite, so they're stealthy in a way, not in the common way. It's sort of like how a wood plane would be stealthy, or a balsa wood plane would be in a somewhat stealthy, but you would sort of have this effect of because it's it's low, slow, it doesn't present the normal air target. It may potentially somehow be avoiding being picked up by radar until it gets pretty close in, allowing them to conduct standoff strikes and reconnaissance missions against Russian forces. That still is a question that we probably won't get the answer to. We've seen the Saudis have similar issues trying to interdict various drones coming from Yemen from Houthi forces, especially with Patriots. And the best counter for that we've seen has been the Saudis, actually shooting them down with aircraft. I think that may be an issue for Russia right now.
Yeah, exactly. The one thing the Houthis don't have, which obviously allows Saudi to come in, and shoot down these drones of aircraft, is they don't have. I mean, for one, they don't have any aircraft of their own, and for two, their air defense system is very, very limited. They only have a handful of systems, don't they? So obviously, yes, it's not as dangerous for the the Saudi Air Force to come in and shoot down these drones. Whereas if Russia was suddenly trying to come down a lot lower with their aircraft, and shooting down these TB2s, obviously they're becoming more vulnerable themselves.
One thing we have seen, at least with the situation more in Libya, that sort of displayed one of the weaknesses of the TB2, is that the claim is the Pantsir actually has a pretty good kill record on the TB2, which there may be a couple of reasons for that, but one of the primary sort of thoughts has been that IR systems are a bit more effective than radar-based systems at obtaining a lock on on something like a TB2. Again, a lot of this is based on information that we don't have access to and probably never will get access to. But the one thing that we can say is that the TB2s have been incredibly effective.
Yeah, no, and I think we've seen one. Has one been shot down? Maybe two in Ukraine. I think we've seen a photo of possibly one. I don't know if you've seen any more.
I would have to double check. I'm not sure. I personally haven't seen anything that was confirmed as being downed at this point, so I'm not sure.
No, I feel like Russia would jump on that immediately as a to try and get a propaganda win, because they spent a lot of time saying how useless the TB2 was and how ineffective it'll be. Both the government and the well, not so much the government, but definitely like the state media was talking about the TB2 a lot and saying it's ineffective. But I think it's pretty obvious that the Russian government themselves were a little worried about the TB2 just by how annoyed they were that the Turkey was selling them to Ukraine.
Well, not just selling, but delivering.
Delivery, yeah.
Delivery of the last confirmed delivery that we had was, I think, let me double check here. Was March 2nd? I think was the last actual confirmed delivery from Turkey to Ukraine. So obviously Turkey or Ukraine is still acquiring them, but it's a very threatening asset to Russia.
Mm-hmm. No, definitely, and it's been very, very successful in striking, like I said, like high value targets like air defense, and also the logistics convoys.
Yeah, the artillery control station we saw destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
That was again, it's mainly the high value targets, like you said, that are getting damaged.
No, for sure.
Which again is very much a great asset for the Ukrainians, as they're able to sort of make up for potential a lack of Air Force interdiction with more common fixed wing jet aircraft, versus actually going out with smaller drones and destroying targets. We saw piecemeal strikes by Su-24s and some other aircraft, but again, it's more the danger. The Russian air defense system is pretty good at shooting down large fixed wing targets, which again is one of the reasons why the Ukrainians have been less. It's not that they lack the capability at the moment. It's that they don't exactly want to lose most of their aircraft to Russian ground fire. Whereas the Russians are forced to more utilize their aircraft, which, at this point, they are losing a number of aircraft. It did slow down. I think last weekend was pretty bad for them. Losing multiple Su-34s was definitely a sign that things had gone pretty badly. And again, it was confirmed in video from Russian state media that the Su-34s had been taking off with dumb bombs and most likely trying to conduct strikes in range of Ukrainian short range air defense, which is just it's highly dangerous to do something like that. Shooting down fourth plus generation aircraft with 30-40-year-old, even sometimes, I mean, if we're talking about 1970s era systems, we're talking about almost 50-year-old systems here, shooting down modern aircraft, which it's very, very dangerous in the modern environment to have an aircraft with unguided munitions. It's just something that if the Russians had more smart munitions or had more precision guided munitions, they would just be able to sit up at cruising altitude and drop munitions on Ukrainian targets, but they can't. If you've seen pretty much any of the videos released, there were a couple a day from Su-25s, and they were flying very low, well within manpad range, conducting strikes on Ukrainian targets, and it's very risky to fly aircraft into an environment like that, and we've seen the Russian Air Force pay for that, and so they probably will continue to limit their capabilities, and sort of defer that down to the Russian artillery forces, which we've seen very active. And there were some people who were talking about the fact that the needs of the Russian artillery forces have actually strained the Russian supply lines more than they were expecting, which I tend to agree with. They've used a lot of rocket artillery munitions, cluster munitions, and other types of artillery to really attack Ukrainian forces. And the lack of precision guided artillery munitions has sort of hurt them in the number that they've needed to use to get the same effect.
Yeah, no, definitely. John, is your mic working? Do you want to give it a go, or is it still?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's much better.
Yeah.
Oh,
That's better, is it?
no, nope,
Yeah,
never mind.
You're still. Oh man, yeah, but it's again the lack of combined joint fire support for the Russians has really hurt them. And I think again a lot of the Russian military is still built on sort of the older Soviet style of we're going to have a war in Western Europe and we're going to use breakthrough forces and we're going to use helicopters to transport forward troops and capture NATO assets. And I think that really doesn't work in the modern day battlefield, where the importance of smart munitions and integrated fire support is just hugely important.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, do you want? Should we touch on Iran, or should we see if anyone's got any questions regarding Ukraine?
I mean, there's not really much to talk about with Iran. I mean, they're up to their normal shenanigans, like
I mean, a little
for
bit,
lack of a better term.
yeah, a little bit beyond normal, I'd say. The ballistic missiles again, but it's completely up to you.
We've I mean, over the past 4 or 5 years, we've seen a number of those attacks. Coming from Iran. I think this was like the fifth now that Iran has utilized, short range ballistic missiles or, other types of missiles from Iranian territory to strike targets in Iraq. I mean, they did not target U.S. assets. They targeted, what they claim was, Mossad assets in revenge for the Israeli strike that killed a couple of IRGC officers. But I do not really think that. I mean, I genuinely don't really think they hit anything. It was more of a message more than anything.
Yeah.
But at this point, I think, the deal is probably going to go through, whatever the JCPOA V2 looks like. Mostly because, again, at the moment, the U.S. kind of needs that oil supply. Though the oil market has stabilized a lot since the Russian invasion. But it's something that we're really going to see moving into the future. Whether or not Iran decides to keep making these attacks on Iraqi territory, if we're going to see more Iranian involvement, either through PMUs or the Iranian militias inside Iraq, it really is a question of what that looks like if there is a deal.
Yeah.
And it's mainly a wait and see issue because. I'm not saying that it's kind of an unnecessary conflict at this point, but it's. I think the war in Ukraine has sort of contextualized some of these issues into something that I don't think the U.S. exactly wants to fight, or Iran doesn't necessarily want to fight at this point. I really think again the conflict in Ukraine has very much contextualized a lot of other conflicts around the world.
Yeah, no, definitely. It was just really, really bad timing. Iran was about to start acting up again, obviously in the middle of Ukraine. And again, it was like I said, it was almost certainly a retaliation for the 2 IRGC operatives that were killed in Syria last week. Although I did see wasn't the Israeli assessment that wasn't the response for that they're still expecting an actual response, and that the missile.
We haven't seen one, so that's partially the reality of the situation. So who knows? We really haven't seen a response yet, and I don't think at this point. I mean, it's been a week now since it happened, and I mean, we saw a cyber attack today against Israeli government assets. Sorry, John just might have DM'd me in all caps saying cyber attacks. So that might be a response, but it's less kinetic than I think the Israelis were expecting. Again, it's more one of these. There are a lot of wait and see issues that we have right now, and Iran, the situation in Iraq with Iran, and the situation with Israel really got put on the back burner with the importance of what's happening in Ukraine. And honestly, I think a lot of governments have taken that view as well of, we need to wait and see what happens. Obviously, there's still active negotiations going on between all parties for, again, whatever JCPOA-V2 looks like. And we might see more movement on that this week. But again, things were contextualized over the past few weeks, and I don't think that I really don't think that Iran's going to continue or escalate in any sort of way, and I don't think the U.S. is going to voluntarily escalate. It's when people were saying that the U.S. was going to, bomb Tehran.
Yeah.
That was just that was a ridiculous assessment of the situation.
I mean, if it didn't happen after the ballistic missile attack after the Soleimani killing, I mean, it wasn't going to happen, in that one. And for the US to bomb Tehran or even just bomb Iran in response to a Iranian attack, there have to be US casualties for a start. US either US troops or US citizens are going to have to be killed to kind of trigger any response even similar to a strike directly against Iran. And even in that case, we saw contractors, haven't we? We've seen contractors like wounded, and I think there was contractor killed as well in the last round of escalations. And there was no strike against Iran then. Lots of strikes inside Iraq. Unfortunately, Iraq is currently the kind of battleground between the US and Israel and Iran. All the fighting's happening there and also in Syria. But yeah, it would have to be a huge escalation for the US to even consider strike, or even Israel to consider striking Iran as things stand.
Yeah, and of course, everything when it comes to the nuclear side of things in that situation, both the U.S. and especially Israel has the choice of escalation, where they could effectively do it at any time. And I think we've talked about this a number of times on the podcast, where, again, Israel will not let Iran acquire nuclear weapons, and they will, they will deal with that when they get to it. They've spent money preparing for it. They've attempted to get better tankers from the U.S., which has been not stonewalled or delayed, but it had the request to accelerate the deal was not accepted. But that was mainly a Boeing problem, from what I've heard. So we'll see what happens sort of with that situation. But the Israelis sort of have control over escalation in that regard. So that's something to see in the future. I really don't think anyone has the appetite for escalation at the moment, though.
No. And to tie the whole thing back into Ukraine, as well, I'm touching on something which is something I was discussing the other day with regards to the reports that Russia is recruiting Syrians to go to Ukraine. Again, at the moment, I think it's only in small numbers, but again, I think I said, like, Putin himself alluded to thousands, over 10,000 troops, that they were suggesting might be sent to Ukraine. And if that does happen, if the numbers are sent from Syria in any kind of in the thousands, depending where they're taken from, that's obviously going to weaken. It's going to weaken the Syrian government's position within the country. So whether they get weakened in the fight against ISIS out in the desert to the east, or whether they get weakened on the Idlib or the Aleppo fronts, someone's going to take advantage of that. And obviously, like Turkey and Russia are, always have a bit of a frosty relationship, disregarding the Turkey's in NATO, even without Turkey being in NATO, they have a difficult relationship, should we say, regards to Syria. I would not at all be surprised to see, like either Turkish-backed groups or like HTS themselves, take the initiative and launch an offensive inside Syria if they feel like the Syrian government is weak. And I believe, people, especially like Woofers, whose main focus is Syria, has mentioned that the Russian Air Force has been next to non-existent lying over Aleppo and Idlib since the Ukrainian invasion. So obviously the war in Ukraine is having an effect on the war in Syria in that they've maybe having to ramp down operations late just to, focus on Ukraine a little bit.
Yeah, we did see some joint patrols between the Turkish forces in Syria and the Russians, so that was something we did see right after the start of the invasion, which definitely it was an interesting contrast to seeing TV2 going after Russian forces inside Ukraine, while Russian forces painted with the Z mark were patrolling around with Turkish forces in northern Syria. So we have seen a ramp down of operations. People are unsure. A number of Rapucha class landing ships visited Tartus, picked up. No one really knows what they picked up, and then went over to Crimea. So there are rumors that assets were moved around and things were shuffled. But there's no clear evidence, and the ships are still sort of now just waiting around near Crimea, waiting potentially to do an amphibious landing. But no one is sure of that at the moment, just because it's very unclear what the Russian plans for Odessa are.
Yeah, and again, I think the whole plans were an amphibious landing. Just to touch on that, I think they were expecting to do it on a bunch of uncontested beaches. Like they were almost expected to do it as a propaganda piece. They were going to take the cities, they were going to roll over Ukraine very quickly. Everyone was going to surrender, and then they can get some nice shots of an amphibious landing for propaganda purposes. It seems that Russian ships have been very hesitant to come anywhere near the Ukrainian coast that isn't Russian controlled as things stand. There was the rumors / claim that a Russian ship got struck by Ukrainian missiles a few days ago. I know they said it was sunk, but I've seen no evidence of that. Always seen with some kind of grainy photos of like smoke on a horizon. But it seems like something was hit, and Ukraine are claiming it was a Russian ship. Ukraine, obviously their anti-ship capabilities haven't been really tested as things stand because there hasn't been a real attempt made. And I believe I think the US even claimed that what had happened, an amphibious landing. But again, I don't think there was no evidence released. They just kind of said it happened. I feel like we would have seen at least a couple of photos or a video of something like that, had happened on the coast.
I think you can summarize pretty much the entire situation in Ukraine by, sources have disputed this, or sources do not, share the same information on this. It's definitely something we have seen. We have seen inconsistencies between, what are normally very highly reliable sources. And trying to sort through that is very hard. It's difficult.
Yeah, and it is difficult because a lot of the excellent sources on this war are Ukrainian themselves. So obviously, they understandably, emotions run high when reporting on a war against your own country. So you see a lot of people who again do excellent journalism, and then they will tweet something about the ghost of Kiev again. And you're like, oh, come on, it's obviously propaganda. One guy hasn't shot down 70 jets, as I think the claim was at the moment. And it's or maybe not one guy, but I think Ukraine are claiming they've shot down 70 jets and 90 helicopters, and it's not based in reality, is it?
Yeah, but and then at the same time, though, we see the Russian government come out a few days into the invasion and admit that they've taken over 2,000 casualties. 500 wounded. 500 dead, 1,600 wounded. And then the Ukrainian claims, aren't like ridiculous, and they're definitely not off by a factor of 10 at that time. So it's really hard to figure out a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, if we had counterclaims from the Russians over a lot of things, it would be easier to, or I'm assuming easier
to kind of split the difference a little bit.
Yeah, but it's very difficult at the moment to try to kind of figure that out, or sort through a lot of the conflicting information that we're getting.
No, and people like Oryx obviously are doing fantastic work in terms of tracking losses on both Russian and Ukrainian side.
Yeah, if there is one person to trust on like baseline numbers, it's Oryx. Like period.
Yeah, absolutely.
But again, still don't have evidence of a couple of IL-76s shot down.
No, and they're big planes. There would be some wreckage somewhere. And it can't even really be explained as, oh, maybe they crashed in Belarus or they crashed in Russia, because even when that's happened, I believe there was an Su-24, maybe an Su-25 got shot down over Ukraine and crash landed in Belarus. Photos of that came out very, very quickly. Speaking of IL-76, I'm just had a look on Flight Radar. We've got one recently taken off from Minsk and just headed into Russia. So
the regular supplies or troops are actually probably aviation supplies, because I know the Russians are operating some of their heavier assets out of, I am forgetting the name of the air base right outside of Minsk, but that's one of the bases they've been using.
Yeah.
But again, at this point, I mean, we're seeing the Russians run into things that I think people had kind of postulated as a possibility at the beginning of the invasion, like supply issues, and is 200,000 troops, or is that enough troops to actually occupy Ukraine? Not really. How long do the Russians expect to fight this war? Will the Russian economy survive heavy sanctions? And I think a lot of those things are or remain unanswered. And I don't think the Russian high command had answers for them either, due to certain operational actions they've taken, particularly the airborne landing near Kiev, or correction, the repeated attempts at airborne landings at Hostomel. Sort of gave us that indication that there was a lot of planning to win the war in 3 days.
Yeah,
not a lot of planning after that.
In terms of we said how long they expected to fight the war, I believe there was, again, you have to be skeptical, take it with a couple of pinch of salt. Anytime there's a claim that documents have been found on a killed soldier or whatever, but there was, I believe, those documents that were found on, again, a killed Russian soldier, which suggested a kind of a 15-day roadmap, right, of the invasion and winning of the war in Ukraine. So I believe that had that had plans of up until 15 days. And okay, let's just for a second, let's just assume that it was an actual legitimate document. 15 days would have put us until Friday. Or day 15 itself would have been, I think, the Thursday. But yeah, so day 15 would have been Friday. We're now on Monday, so
I mean, it does seem
we're day 18. We're in day 18. So if that document is legit, we're 72 hours past where Russia expected the war to be over by.
I think one of the other things is, after day 5, we really have not seen much Russian, or many Russian concentrated offensives of where they have built up combat power and then attempted to make a push. Really haven't seen the last 2 weeks now, which is definitely a sign that the Russians, they're not vamping necessarily. They're not making it up as they go along, but there is an indication that they aren't entirely prepared or had the operational preparations to actually start doing things. So we may see, or what may be happening is things may be happening in the background. The Russians may be sort of reassessing their current situation and trying to figure out how to salvage this operation into something that they can actually turn into a victory. I mean, at this point they have the capability to do that. They definitely have air superiority in the north, though their limited supplies of precision guided munitions are causing them a lot of trouble. We've seen them sort of take a lot of advantage in the south, where their especially VDV heavy units have been able to actually capture some cities, like Kherson, like Melitopol.
Yeah.
So they've actually made progress in that manner.
Yeah, they've been very successful in the south. I mean, for all the issues they have in the north, the south they seem they've had very little issues like that.
In fairness, in the south, by day 2, they were basically just able to drive columns on the road.
They were pretty much at Kherson,
all
right?
the way to Kherson. I mean, they were basically just doing a road march at that point. So one of the main advantages of that is the Ukrainian defenses were not really in place in the south. And the south was just easy to travel around. I mean, it's flat. There isn't the mud issue that there is in the north. And so it was pretty easy for the Russians to push fairly far, fairly fast. But over the last few days, we haven't really seen much movement, especially towards Odessa, especially breaking out over the Dnieper. We've seen fighting around Mariupol, but really apart from that, that's mainly where the bulk of the fighting in the south is right now. So we saw them start quickly, but they've sort of lost some of that offensive momentum over the past at least 2 weeks now, frankly.
Yeah, and I suppose the main thing is although the offensives seem to have stalled a little bit, they're definitely not being pushed back either. At least not in any kind of any kind of huge numbers. They're we get the occasional report that maybe a couple of villages have been retaken by Ukraine, or they've regained some territory in XYZ or whatever. Ukraine are doing a really good job at holding holding a line now. But the areas which they lost, in the first couple of days, where they lost a lot of territory very quickly, they haven't been able to regain any of that, and that's going to be the main thing for Russia at the moment. Is they still occupy a large area of Ukraine.
Not a lot of urban area, though. It's a lot of empty space that they've taken.
Yeah, so a large area in the south, and they really haven't gained a lot in the Donbass, which obviously, was the claimed whole point of this offensive was, that Russians have been genocided in the Donbass and yada yada yada. And obviously they recognize the republics, the Donetsk and Luhansk republics. How long before the invasion? 24 hours? 48 hours? Very, very...
About 48.
Yeah. And then it was the peacekeepers, which very quickly turned into whatever the opposite of peacekeepers are. But yeah, they really haven't gained a lot of ground in the Donbass region, which is going to be an issue.
That was where we saw a concentration of Ukrainian forces before the conflict even started.
And the most battle-hardened troops, obviously. They've been, they might have been not fighting a very quick-moving war, but they have been at war for the last 8 years, in that region.
I think the main thing for them, at least right now, is the fact that they failed to take Kiev. They do not hold the center of governmental, power in Ukraine. They don't. Which is, they can't install a puppet government. They can't they can't do anything right now to actually affect the Ukrainian government, which is a huge issue for them at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, they only have the one regional city, isn't it, which is Kherson.
Yeah, they took Kherson, and that the more important thing about that was obtaining a crossing over the Dnieper. So it's at this point, I do think the Russians will try to focus on taking Kiev. That is their main objective. Taking Mariupol as well is going to be a huge thing for them, just because that's a thing for the rebel or the separatist territory. That's a very important city for them. And so at this point, we're probably going to we're going to see those continue to be the main two focus areas. And I think some other people had commented on the fact that the Russians have also turned to destroying strategic military targets inside of Ukraine, especially defense manufacturing targets. So, we saw the plant that makes MiG-29 engines, or, both produces and repairs them, destroyed. And I think we'll continue to see targets like that as part of, the Russian demilitarization effort. Though at this point, I mean that's a secondary goal to actually controlling territory within Kiev, or within Ukraine, more specifically Kiev. Okay, I think
Yeah.
George wants to talk.
Cool.
Does he? No. Okay. Yeah, but at this point, I think that's one of the that's one of the main goals, and they haven't been able to do it. And the longer they wait, I think it's the harder it's going to get for them.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, it's been an hour and 15 minutes. I think that's usual episode length, right? We don't have John in the corner this episode to sort of yell at us when we should wind things down. So I mean, at this point, I think we can pretty much solidly say the Russians, they haven't lost. Obviously, they still have a path to victory. I do believe that involves taking and controlling Kiev. That's the overall, I think, intention at this point. And to solidify their holdings where, maybe they can continue to control the Crimean Canal in order to provide a solid water supply to Crimea. But at this point, they are going to be very hard pressed to do that. And it's something that they're going to take a lot of losses doing. And that's going to put internal pressure on Russia, especially as their economy continues to do a bit of a downward slide
Yes.
as a result of sanctions. Yeah, and I think Western governments have frankly handled this entire situation fairly well. The MiG-29 debacle was more of a communication issue than anything. I do frankly believe that if things had been quieter, it would have gotten done. But apart from that, it's better when things are done in secrecy, at least for this. But yeah, I think that's where we sort of currently stand. The continued Russian focus in the south and around Kiev will be a main characterizing factor over the next week.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, just to wrap things up, I think definitely. Obviously they want to take Kiev. I don't know, will that end the war? Taking Kiev. Maybe not. Very difficult to say.
But it'll certainly make it easier for the Russians to claim that they won.
Yes, no, absolutely.
Which is, I think, something that Putin really wants at this point.
Yeah, no, they need something to present back home, right? They don't really have anything at the moment. The Russian people aren't going to be, landed over, Kherson and Melitopol. They're not major cities, and for one thing, they're on the opposite end of Ukraine to the Russian border. They probably have they probably don't have as much in common, with the Russian people as people maybe in Kharkiv or Kiev. So they're going to want.
Syria is still somewhat Russian speaking, but
they're Russian speaking.
They're more pissed than anything else, which is not something I think the Russians wanted.
No, and there was the mayor of Odessa, who, from what I was reading, is kind of largely seen as quite pro-Russian, or maybe not as anti-Russian as maybe a lot of other Ukrainian mayors. And he's fully on the anti-Russia bandwagon now. I saw he had quite a long rant about after some missiles hit Odessa, he was very, very unhappy, should we say, unsurprisingly. So, even people inside Ukraine who were maybe prior to the war, maybe, more sympathetic towards Russia and had, maybe more, feeling maybe a little bit closer towards Russia. A lot of that goodwill is very rapidly disappearing amongst, ordinary Ukrainians, I think.
Yeah, and I think, again, that's one of the greatest losses for Russia during this invasion is the complete galvanization of Ukrainian resistance to sort of Russian influence at this point. And I don't think that's something that will change for a while. And from the Ukrainians I have talked to, even the ones who were, on the fence before the invasion, they are very, very solidly against Russia right now, and I think will continue to be into the future, which is a major loss for Russia, especially in the eastern areas and the areas that are closer to Russia were still primarily Russian speaking or heavily Russian speaking. Losing a lot of those people as potential assets it's going to hurt them long term with any of their intentions with Ukraine or any of their aspirations.
No, absolutely.
And I think we're actually going to sort of end this episode here. I don't know if John is still alive on his end, but it was great having all of you. Thank you for listening to this live. I think we peaked at 1,250 people.
Wow.
It was definitely nice to have all of you listening. We're gonna try to continue to do this for the rest of the season. It actually worked surprisingly well. I'll probably come with more notes next time. But yeah, this is definitely something that we're going to continue to do into the future.